Oh, do come in. It seems we have another little puzzle on our hands, don't we?
Miss Marple and the Curate's Missing Sermon, narrated by Connor from Velvet Clues. Welcome to Velvet Clues, where mysteries unfold like morning mist over quiet village greens. I'm your host, Connor, and tonight we delve into one of Miss Jane Marple's most perplexing cases, a tale where silence spoke louder than any sermon, and missing words proved more dangerous than those ever spoken aloud. So settle in with your evening tea, and let me transport you to the seemingly peaceful village of St. Mary Mead, where even the most sacred spaces harbour the darkest secrets. Chapter 1. The Pulpit's Empty Promise. The bells of St. Mary Mead's ancient church had just finished their morning call to worship when Miss Jane Marple settled into her usual pew, third from the front on the right, where the acoustics were particularly favourable for those of advancing years. The October morning had dawned crisp and clear, autumn sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows and casting jewelled patterns across the worn stone floor. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and opened her prayer book, but her keen blue eyes soon noticed unusual activity near the chancel. The Reverend Leonard Clement appeared uncharacteristically flustered, his calm manner replaced by visible anxiety. He whispered urgently to young Curate Timothy Ashford, who stood clutching a leather portfolio to his chest with white-knuckled hands. The curate, a slight man of 28, with prematurely thinning hair and earnest grey eyes, looked paler than usual. His hands trembled as he arranged papers on the lectern. Around them, the congregation settled into expectant silence. Mrs. Bantry, resplendent in her new autumn hat, leaned toward Miss Marple with a questioning glance. "Today's sermon," announced Reverend Clement, "will be delivered by our esteemed curate, Mr. Ashford, on the subject of moral courage in times of adversity." Curate Ashford stepped to the pulpit. The carved oak, with its intricate biblical scenes, seemed to dwarf his fragile frame. He set the portfolio on the angled reading surface and opened it carefully. What happened next sent a ripple of concern through the church. His face drained of colour, his mouth opened soundlessly. "My sermon," he whispered hoarsely. "My notes, they're gone." The portfolio was completely empty, save for a single page bearing the heading "Moral Courage in Times of Adversity." Miss Marple watched as panic seized him. He swayed, gripping the pulpit's sides. "I must tell the truth about what I discovered." His words broke off. Before Reverend Clement could reach him, Curate Ashford collapsed, striking his head on the pulpit as he fell. Gasps swept the nave. Dr. Haydock, visiting his sister, rushed forward. "He's alive," he announced after a swift examination, "but he's suffered a severe shock, possibly cardiac, though he's young for it. We must get him to hospital at once." As others gathered to help, Miss Marple noticed small but telling details. The portfolio's clasp bore a fragment of red sealing wax, and near the rear of the church, a solitary figure slipped quietly toward a side exit, using the confusion as cover. Once the ambulance had carried the curate away, Miss Marple lingered under the pretense of collecting her gloves. Her eyes swept the pulpit, where she saw a faint dusting of white powder, flour or something finer, on the wood where the portfolio had rested. Even the hymnboard showed signs of tampering. One brass digit hung slightly askew. Noting the chosen hymns, 247, 198 and 334, Miss Marple turned as Reverend Clement approached, his face drawn. "Miss Marple," he said, "did you notice anything unusual about Timothy's behaviour? He seemed so agitated." "He did indeed," she replied softly. "Tell me, Vicar, did he mention his sermon topic to you?" The Reverend sighed. "He changed it only last evening. From the harvest festival to this. He said it was a matter of utmost importance to the parish's spiritual welfare." As Miss Marple walked home beneath the bright morning sun, her mind was already working. A missing sermon, a collapse, and the unmistakable signs of tampering. Whatever the curate had meant to reveal that morning, someone had made certain his words would not be heard. Chapter 2. Secrets in the Vestry Shadows. The following morning found Miss Marple in her garden, tending to her late-blooming roses while her mind circled the events of the previous day. She had slept poorly, her thoughts returning again and again to Curate Ashford's collapse and the vanished sermon notes. Instinct told her that this was no simple fainting spell. Her reflections were interrupted by the brisk arrival of Mrs. Bantry, who came hurrying up the garden path, cheeks flushed with excitement. "Jane, my dear, you'll never guess what I've discovered about poor Mr. Ashford." Miss Marple set down her secateurs and raised an eyebrow. "Indeed, Dolly. I trust he's recovering well." "That's just it," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. "I visited the hospital this morning with flowers, and Dr. Morrison told me the strangest thing. They can find absolutely nothing wrong with him. His heart is sound, his blood pressure normal, and he's already sitting up asking for his papers." "How very curious," Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Bantry leaned closer, lowering her voice. "He keeps asking whether anyone found his sermon notes. When I told him no, he looked absolutely terrified. Jane, I think he's frightened of something, or someone." A healthy young man, struck down by shock, and papers gone missing. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Then perhaps, my dear, the time has come to tidy up a few things at the church." An hour later, Miss Marple stood in the vestry of St. Mary Mead's Church. The Reverend Clement had gratefully accepted her offer to help put things in order after the previous day's excitement. The small room smelled faintly of incense and old wood polish. She moved quietly among the shelves, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. It was then she noticed one of the older psalters had been replaced upside down. To anyone else it would seem trivial, but Miss Marple knew that Miss Hartnell, the parish's fastidious librarian, would never have allowed such disorder. She lifted the volume carefully. Between pages 247 and 248 lay several modern sheets of paper covered in Curate Ashford's neat handwriting. Her pulse quickened as she read. The sermon was in fact a detailed account of financial irregularities in the church's accounts, dates, amounts, and evidence of systematic theft. The name that appeared repeatedly made Miss Marple's lips tighten. Miss Letitia Hartnell, Treasurer. Ashford had written that he intended to confront her privately before revealing the truth from the pulpit. The meeting had been scheduled for the evening before his collapse. Closing the psalter, Miss Marple replaced it precisely as she had found it and noted the hymn number connected to the hidden pages, 247. She had just turned when footsteps sounded in the corridor. Miss Hartnell herself entered, her normally rigid composure strained. "Miss Marple, I hear you were present when poor Mr. Ashford collapsed. Tell me, did he drop any papers?" Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "I fear everything happened too quickly, my dear, though I did notice his portfolio appeared quite empty." Relief flickered across the treasurer's face, but Miss Marple also noted a small scratch on her wrist, and, caught in her bracelet's clasp, a tiny fragment of red sealing wax. When Miss Hartnell had gone, Miss Marple stood alone amid the shadows of the vestry. She now knew what the curate had discovered, and who had reason to silence him. The question remaining was how far Miss Hartnell would go to protect her secret. Chapter 3. The Wax Seal's Silent Testament. Miss Marple returned home from her morning's discoveries with a heavy heart. The missing sermon had revealed a grave financial scandal, but perhaps something darker as well. Yet suspicion was not proof. She was pondering this when Cherry, her housekeeper, appeared. "A visitor for you, ma'am. Mrs. Price, the curate's fiancée." A pale young woman stepped nervously into the sitting room. "Miss Marple, I hope you don't mind my coming. Everyone says you understand people. I'm frightened for Timothy." Miss Marple offered her tea. "I hear he's recovering well." "That's what's so strange," Mrs. Price said, twisting her handkerchief. "He told me someone tried to poison him." Miss Marple's expression did not change, though her pulse quickened. "Poison, my dear?" "Yes. He believes it was something that caused temporary paralysis, something that wouldn't show up in ordinary tests. he said he began, feeling unwell after taking communion at the early service. "The communion wine," Miss Marple murmured. "And has he shared this with anyone else?" "He tried, but the doctors think it was shock. He said he tasted something bitter, but didn't wish to alarm anyone." Miss Marple's mind turned rapidly. To tamper with a sacred element would require both knowledge and access, both of which Miss Hartnell possessed. Mrs. Price hesitated, then added, "A week ago he received a letter sealed with red wax. It upset him terribly. After that he spent nights studying old account books. He said he had found something dreadful about someone in the parish, someone he had trusted." The red wax again. Miss Marple recalled the fragment she had seen on Miss Hartnell's bracelet, and another on the portfolio's clasp. "Did you see this letter?" "No, he locked it away. But that evening he said it was his duty to tell the truth no matter the cost." As the young woman spoke, Miss Marple's thoughts arranged themselves into an orderly pattern. The curate had discovered Miss Hartnell's theft, confronted her, and received a warning, the letter sealed with wax. When he persisted, she had acted to silence him by adulterating the communion wine and stealing his notes. "My dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "your fiancé is brave, but he must take care. Has he spoken of returning to his duties soon?" "Yes, tomorrow morning, in fact. He says truth cannot wait." Miss Marple nodded gravely. "Then perhaps truth will need a little help." When Mrs. Price left, Miss Marple sat long in thought. She had enough evidence to accuse Miss Hartnell, but not to convict. And the woman, desperate and cornered, might strike again. "Desperation," Miss Marple murmured, "is the most dangerous poison of all." That afternoon she resolved to visit the hospital herself. If she could convince the curate to trust her, they might together bring the truth to light. Safely. Chapter 4. The Communion Cup's Dark Secret. The next afternoon, Miss Marple entered Milchester General Hospital, carrying a modest bouquet of chrysanthemums. The corridors smelled of disinfectant and boiled tea. In a small private room, Curate Ashford sat upright in bed, pale but alert. "Miss Marple," he said warmly, "how kind of you to come." "My dear Mr. Ashford," she replied, placing the flowers in a glass. "We were all dreadfully concerned. How are you feeling?" "Physically better," he said with a weary smile, "but deeply troubled. I believe someone tried to stop me from preaching yesterday. I think I was drugged." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Then perhaps you should tell me everything." He described how, during the early communion service, the wine had tasted slightly bitter. Within the hour he felt dizzy, confused, and weak. "By the time I reached the pulpit I could scarcely think, then everything went black." "You suspect the communion wine was tampered with?" "I do, and I fear who might be responsible. I discovered serious irregularities in our church accounts, money missing from the charity and restoration funds. When I confronted our treasurer, she denied everything and warned me not to make unwise accusations." Miss Marple's suspicions crystallized. "Miss Hartnell?" He nodded gravely. "Yes, I meant to reveal her wrongdoing in yesterday's sermon. It was my duty." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Mr. Ashford, I took the liberty of tidying the vestry yesterday. I found your notes, hidden inside a psalter." He looked astonished. "Then she stole them?" "It seems so, and I fear she may attempt worse if she believes you still intend to expose her." The young man's expression wavered between relief and dread. "I can't hide, Miss Marple. The truth must be spoken." "Indeed," she said softly, "but sometimes truth needs staging as careful as any sermon. You must let me handle Miss Hartnell." He hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. What do you intend?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "If she used the communion cup to conceal her sin, perhaps we shall use the same sacred vessel to reveal it." As she left the hospital, Miss Marple's mind was already formulating the plan. She would ensure that Miss Hartnell's next visit to the church would not be one of prayer, but of reckoning. Outside, the autumn sun slanted through the trees, and the bells of St. Mary Mead tolled faintly in the distance, a solemn reminder that even the holiest places could echo with deceit. Chapter 5. The Treasurer's Ledger Tells All. Dawn found Miss Marple with a plan as neat as her knitting. Suspicion was one thing, proof quite another. She walked to the police station and laid her findings before Inspector Slack. The stolen notes, the red wax, the bitter communion, the treasurer with keys to everything. The inspector listened, pen tapping, sceptical but attentive. "Even if the curate was drugged," he said, "we've no direct link to Miss Hartnell." "Then let us furnish one," Miss Marple replied mildly. "If she believes Mr. Ashford returns today to resume his inquiry, she will hurry to remove the evidence. Desperate people tidy in a great rush, Inspector." By late morning, Miss Marple happened upon Miss Hartnell at the post office. The treasurer looked drawn, eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. "How fortunate," Miss Marple beamed. "I've just come from the hospital. Mr. Ashford is to be discharged this afternoon. He means to work late this evening. Some business with the old financial ledgers." Colour fled from Miss Hartnell's face. Her handbag slipped, scattering contents across the tiled floor. As they stooped, Miss Marple noticed a small brass key stamped with a cross, the church's mark. The treasurer snatched it up with shaking fingers. "I do hope," Miss Marple added sweetly, "that nothing important has been mislaid among the records." That evening, the church lay quiet under a cold, clear sky. From the shelter of the yews, Miss Marple watched a tall, angular figure slip along the rectory path and unlock the vestry side door. A faint yellow glow sprang up within. 10 minutes later, Miss Marple signalled. Inspector Slack and Sergeant Lake moved from their hiding place. Inside, the scene was brisk industry turned to crime. Papers were heaped upon the table in careful stacks, receipts, collection tallies, restoration ledgers, while the small vestry fireplace crackled greedily. Miss Hartnell fed the flames with steady hands, her face set and strangely calm. "Miss Hartnell," said Inspector Slack, stepping forward, "that will do." She spun about. For a moment defiance blazed, then her shoulders sagged. Sergeant Lake was already lifting the top ledger. "These are account books, sir. Multiple years. Pages torn out." Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. "Letitia, Mr. Ashford's research was thorough. Burning these will not erase the truth written elsewhere." Something in the kindness pierced the armour. The treasurer sank onto a chair. "It began with my mother," she whispered. "Nursing, medicines. There was never enough. I told myself I would repay every penny. Arthur said he could help set the figures straight." "Arthur?" the inspector prompted. "Arthur Pemberton. He understands accounts. We adjusted small sums at first. Pounds no one would miss. But small sums grow, Inspector. And when the curate started asking questions..." She pressed trembling fingers to her temples. "I only wanted to delay him. I had a sedative left from Mother's last days. A few drops in the communion wine at early service. Just enough to make him falter. I swear I meant no lasting harm." "The sealed letters?" Miss Marple asked softly. "My grandmother's wax and stamp," she said, defeated. "I thought a warning might frighten him into silence." Inspector Slack cautioned her formally and took possession of the surviving ledgers. On the hearth the fire hissed as he doused it. Charred curls of paper collapsed into ash. Yet enough remained. Untorn volumes, duplicate tallies, and above all, a confession spoken plainly. As they led Miss Hartnell out, Miss Marple touched the mantel where the warming fire had been. "Truth," she murmured, "endures better than paper." The bell in the tower tolled the quarter hour, steady and clear. It sounded, to Miss Marple, not like doom, but like the start of accounting, of books set right at last. Chapter 6. The Psalter's Hidden Message. By morning the village buzzed with the news, the treasurer arrested, the ledgers rescued from the flames. In the vicarage study, Reverend Clement and a diocesan auditor pored over figures, while Miss Marple sat quietly by the window, listening, watching. "The preliminary loss," the auditor said, tapping a column, "is considerable. But I notice multiple hands in these books, Vicar." "Yes," sighed the Reverend. "When matters grew complex, Miss Hartnell engaged Arthur Pemberton from the village to assist. He's clever with figures." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the open ledgers. The older entries were in Miss Hartnell's precise, tight script. Newer reconciliations bore a different hand, exact, symmetrical, almost obsessively neat. She thought of the psalter with its hidden pages, its signal number, 247, like a ribbon left for anyone who cared to look. That afternoon, she walked to the neat Pemberton cottage at the end of the lane. The little garden was clipped to perfection, the curtains hung in exact pairs. Mrs. Pemberton, frail and fluttering, admitted her with nervous courtesy. "Arthur will be home presently, Miss Marple. Will you take tea?" Left a moment in the sitting-room, Miss Marple's eye fell upon the small writing desk by the window. On its surface lay a letter sealed with red wax, half sheltered under a blotter. She did not touch it. She merely read the visible salutation. "Dear Miss Hartnell." The script matched the tidy reconciliations in the church books. Arthur entered, pale, spare, careful in his movements. "A shocking business about Miss Hartnell," he said, removing his coat and folding it with geometric precision. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "You were kind to help her with the ledgers. Such work requires discretion." A minute tremor in his hands betrayed him. "I only offered technical advice. I assumed any discrepancies were accidental." "Of course. And yet Mr. Ashford told me your insight proved invaluable to him as well." The name struck like flint. He glanced too quickly toward the desk, where the wax seal glowed a sullen red. "I had nothing to do with what happened to the curate," he said. "That was Letitia's madness. I warned her." "So you knew," Miss Marple said softly, "about the communion wine." His composure failed. He sank onto a chair. "She came to me in panic. I proposed adjustments, carry-forwards, reclassifications, but she said the curate would speak on Sunday and ruin us both. I told her a delay might let me reconcile the gaps. She chose the faster method." "And you?" Miss Marple asked. He covered his eyes. "I drafted letters. I mapped the concealment. I never poured the poison." "But you sealed the lies," Miss Marple said, and her tone was no harsher than the truth. "Arthur, the kindest thing you can do now is help us put the figures and the record right." When Inspector Slack arrived, the letter on the desk needed no prying. Arthur handed it over himself. It outlined a scheme to scatter deficits across years and funds, finished with a cool line about alternative approaches if detection threatened. The inspector took the statement, and with it the last. Pretense of accidental error. Outside, Miss Marple paused beneath the cottage eaves. Wind moved through the hedges with a dry whisper, like pages turning. She thought of the psalter, returned to its shelf, no longer a hiding place, but a witness. In St. Mary Mead, sins preferred tidy covers, balanced books, sealed wax, symmetrical gardens. Yet human nature, she reflected, always leaves a fingerprint on the margin. She turned toward the church. There was still work to do, to comfort the innocent, steady the vicar, and, quietly, to ask whether the conspiracy had truly ended with 2 confessions, or whether another hand had helped pass the wax and count the coins. Chapter 7. The Final Confessions. Wait. The next morning, Inspector Slack arrived at Miss Marple's cottage looking unusually grave. "Our young Mr. Pemberton," he began, "didn't sleep a wink. He's asked to make a full statement." Miss Marple poured tea as he opened his notebook. "I suspected as much," she said. "His confession's quite detailed," the inspector continued. "It seems the embezzlement scheme was his idea in the first place. Miss Hartnell had mounting medical bills for her mother, and Pemberton offered his expertise to smooth the books. Temporarily, he claimed. It began with a few pounds and grew into thousands." Miss Marple sighed softly. Ah, yes, the old story. One pebble loosed, and down comes the hill. Inspector Slack frowned. He admits helping falsify the ledgers, and later conspiring with Hartnell to delay Ashford's sermon. Says they meant to destroy the evidence in a small accidental fire if the drugging didn't succeed. A fire? Yes. They'd arranged combustible papers in the vestry ahead of time. If the curate collapsed or panicked, Hartnell would signal Pemberton to ignite the blaze. Clever enough plan, if wicked. Miss Marple nodded slowly. That explains the powder on the pulpit, a residue from whatever they'd prepared to start it. Exactly, said Slack. They obtained the sedative through one of Pemberton's business contacts, something that causes short paralysis without leaving a trace. He closed his notebook. I'll see both stand trial for embezzlement, attempted poisoning, and conspiracy. I dare say they'll have several years to contemplate moral courage. When he had gone, Miss Marple sat quietly in her garden, gazing at the autumn roses. For all her long acquaintance with human folly, she still felt the ache of wasted goodness. Desperation had twisted two respectable parishioners into criminals. Yet even in tragedy, truth had prevailed. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Eleanor Price, radiant with relief. Miss Marple, Timothy's being discharged this morning. The doctors say he'll make a full recovery. How wonderful, my dear, Miss Marple said warmly. And how does he feel about recent events? Eleanor hesitated. He's conflicted. He keeps saying that perhaps he was too harsh, that Miss Hartnell and Mr. Pemberton acted out of fear, not evil. He wishes to speak at their sentencing, to ask for leniency. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Ah, moral courage indeed. To forgive is often harder than to accuse. Eleanor nodded, her eyes bright. He says he's learned more about faith and human weakness in a week than in all his studies. He's planning a new sermon, something about redemption through truth. When the young woman had gone, Miss Marple folded her hands and looked toward the church steeple, gleaming pale against the morning sky. The case had ended in justice, but also, she hoped, in mercy. For while the law must punish wrongdoing, only forgiveness could heal the wound left behind. As the bells of St. Mary Mead began to ring the hour, Miss Marple murmured to herself, "A sermon unspoken has taught its lesson all the same." Chapter 8. The Communion Cup's Redemption. Sunday dawned bright and clear over St. Mary Mead, the air sharp with promise. Miss Marple took her place in church early, curious to hear Curate Ashford's first sermon since his collapse. The pews filled quickly. Curiosity, compassion, and gossip mingled like incense. When the curate appeared, he looked thinner but steadier, a calm dignity in his movements. He stepped to the same pulpit that had once nearly been his tomb. "Last Sunday," he began, "I intended to speak about moral courage in times of adversity, but perhaps God intended me to live that sermon first." A hush settled. His voice gained strength as he spoke of truth, fear, and forgiveness. He did not mention names, but every listener knew the story. "Moral courage," he said, "is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act rightly despite it. When we shrink from truth, evil grows in silence." Miss Marple glanced around the congregation. Faces were sombre, moved. Mrs. Bantry dabbed her eyes. Colonel Melchett sat rigid, jaw tight. "I stand before you," the curate continued, "not as a victim, but as a witness. I learned that even those who falter deserve understanding. One of those who wronged this parish acted from love, a desperate love for a dying parent. The other from fear of ruin. Their actions were crimes, yes, but not without human cause." He paused, his voice gentling. "Justice will be done, but mercy must not be forgotten. For if we deny mercy, we become the very cruelty we condemn." Miss Marple felt the truth of it stir deeply. The young man's words carried no self-pity, only humility and faith earned through suffering. "I have decided," he said, "to speak at their sentencing, not for punishment, but for redemption. The lesson of this tragedy is not that sin exists, but that forgiveness can transform even the darkest deceit into light. As he concluded, sunlight streamed through the high windows, bathing the pulpit in golden fire. The U.S. congregation rose, stirred beyond speech. Miss Marple remained seated for a long moment, reflecting. The missing sermon had finally been delivered, not from the pages stolen, but from the heart of one who had lived it. Truth had survived poison and deceit, and in its survival it had transfigured pain into grace. When the final hymn ended, Miss Marple lingered in her pew. The bell tolled noon, steady, pure, and merciful. She whispered to herself, "The cup that carried poison now carries forgiveness. That is the miracle of St. Mary Mead." Chapter 9. The Bell Tower's Witness. 3 weeks later, the church bell tower reopened after repairs. Miss Marple climbed the narrow spiral staircase beside Curate Ashford, who had invited her to witness the ceremonial first ringing. Dust motes drifted through beams of late afternoon light as they reached the chamber, where ancient bells hung silent in their wooden frames. "How fitting," he said softly, "that these bells should ring again after all we've endured." Miss Marple smiled. "The village listens differently now, I think. Once for gossip, now perhaps for grace." As others gathered for the short prayer of thanksgiving, Miss Marple's eye caught something carved into the stone pillar near the stairs. LH and AP, for the greater good. The initials chilled her. "Those letters," she asked quietly, "when were they made?" Ashford examined them. When Miss Hartnell first became treasurer, she and Pemberton marked their partnership here, to serve the church with diligence, they said. How strange those words look now. A monument to misplaced purpose, Miss Marple murmured. After the blessing, as the first bell note rang clear, Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Pemberton standing apart from the others, small and pale beneath her shawl. When the service ended, Miss Marple approached her gently. "My dear, how are you bearing all this?" The old woman gave a strained smile. "The Lord sustains me, Miss Marple, but there's something you should know, something Arthur confessed before the trial. There was a third person involved." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "A third?" Mrs. Pemberton nodded, voice trembling. "Someone who had access to the parish records, who knew which families gave what and which letters could be intercepted. Arthur said he promised never to tell, but I can't carry the secret any longer." Miss Marple placed a steadying hand on her arm. "You've done rightly, my dear. Secrets fester in silence." They descended together as the bells continued their solemn toll. Miss Marple's mind was already turning. If there truly was a third conspirator, someone unseen yet essential, then St. Mary Mead's shadows were not yet dispelled. Outside, the fading light touched the church steeple with crimson glow. "For the greater good," Miss Marple repeated under her breath, the most dangerous phrase in human language. The bells rang again, echoing through the village, no longer a call to worship alone, but a warning that even in the holiest of places, sin often wears the mask of duty. Chapter 10. The Sermon's True Legacy. By the following morning, Miss Marple had already summoned Inspector Slack to her cottage. The kettle hissed on the hob, the scent of fresh tea mingling with the chill October air. "Inspector," she began calmly, "I fear our case is not yet closed." Slack, who had hoped otherwise, sighed. "You're referring to Mrs. Pemberton's story about a third conspirator?" "Precisely. Someone who knew every family's finances and could intercept parish mail. Such knowledge would make embezzlement remarkably efficient." The inspector frowned thoughtfully. "That would mean someone inside the church office itself. Someone like Mrs. Gladys Morrison," Miss Marple finished quietly, "the parish secretary." They went together that afternoon. The secretary's office smelled of ink and lavender polish, papers stacked neatly upon her desk. Mrs. Morrison, a pale widow in her 40s, looked up from her ledger with forced composure, Inspector! Miss Marple! What a surprise! Routine follow-up, Slack said smoothly. We're tracing how the stolen funds were concealed. Miss Marple's sharp gaze wandered across the desk and stopped on a sealed envelope. A thick red wax seal gleamed faintly in the lamplight. She recognized it instantly. How curious, she said lightly. That seal reminds me of the letters Miss Hartnell used for private correspondence. Such a lovely old-fashioned habit. Mrs. Morrison's hands froze on her pen. Just routine parish mail, she said too quickly. Then you won't mind if Inspector Slack has a look. For a moment, defiance flashed in her eyes, then drained away, leaving only weary defeat. She lowered her gaze. There's no need, she whispered. I'll tell you everything. The confession spilled out haltingly. It had been she who provided Hartnell and Pemberton with information about parish donors, their income, habits, and contributions. Letitia said it was only borrowing, Mrs. Morrison murmured. She promised repayment once her mother's estate was settled. And Arthur, he promised I'd receive a share. My husband died leaving debts, Miss Marple. I thought I was helping good people through a difficult time. But you helped them deceive the entire parish, said Slack sternly. Tears welled in her eyes. When Mr. Ashford began investigating, Letitia panicked. She told me the curate's sermon would ruin us all. She made me deliver the warning letter, the one sealed with wax. So it was you, Miss Marple said gently, who placed the letter in his study. Mrs. Morrison nodded. I didn't know she meant to harm him, I swear it. I thought she only wanted time to put things right. But after he collapsed, I helped destroy records to protect myself. I see now how wrong I was. The inspector took down her statement, sealing the last piece of the puzzle. As they left the church, Miss Marple paused by the porch door, gazing back toward the pulpit where the tragedy had begun. It started with missing pages, she murmured. But what was truly missing was integrity. That Sunday, Curate Ashford stood again before his congregation. His sermon, titled Redemption Through Truth, spoke of how even the gravest wrongdoing could yield wisdom if faced with honesty. We fall, he said, not to remain fallen, but to learn compassion for those who stumble beside us. Miss Marple listened from her pew, the faintest smile touching her lips. The case of the missing sermon had revealed greed, fear, and deceit, but also courage, mercy, and renewal. When the bells of St. Mary Mead rang out at noon, their notes seemed clearer than ever before. They told not for scandal, but for forgiveness, a reminder that truth, once spoken, becomes a hymn that cannot be silenced.